show here at the Datby in the center of Billerica, and I get to trade poems with someone whose work I truly admire. Today's feature is Dave Surette, known in local poetry circles as the man who gave you Malden. Most of us enter the open mic scene very tentatively. We try it, we like it, and eventually people start asking us if we have a chapbook they could buy. And we say no, but that's not a bad idea. I started hitting the open mics in 1993, and it was 1997 before I brought out a chapbook. Dave arrived on the scene about 2 years ago, and he already had a chapbook of poems about growing up in Malden. The first time I heard him read it, I had two thoughts. This guy is going to be a major player on the scene, and this is a man after my own heart. David R. Surette was born and raised in Malden. He earned his degree at Colby College. He is taught in both the Waltham and East Bridgewater public schools. He's the author of 2 poetry chapbooks and has placed poems in a number of literary journals. He lives in southeastern Massachusetts with 4 horses, 3 children, 2 border collies, and 1 wife. This is from a review for his second chapbook, which is called Muckers, Grinders, Shapers, Hangers, Hackers, and Huns. Quote, I was late for work today because I picked up this book and it wouldn't let me go. First it was a baby watching a monarch mobile in sunlight, then the pony that wouldn't let the rider work out his frustrations, the smells in the car the guys always used, the house where every room had a name. Fortunately, it's a small book. I only missed 1 class. That's from Michael Brown, the host of the Boston Poetry Slam. Dave Surette writes exactly the kind of poems, and this is me talking now. Dave writes exactly the kind of poems I would write if I could just write shorter poems. He writes about real things in real words. He writes about the people he grew up with, and they sound like exactly the same people we all grew up with. But somehow, out of all that feels so familiar and often so funny, he draws your eye with seeming effortlessness to the surprising and the poignant. He tells the stories we've been overlooking in our own lives. But this is stand-up poetry, where we don't talk about poetry, we do it. So without further ado, please give your warmest Billerica welcome to today's feature, the man who gave you Malden, Dave Surette.
Thank you. Deborah Park, in 4 parts. The bandstand. A red brick bandstand stood in the center, like a church for teens, where they took part in the adolescent sacraments of smoke, swears, and sex. Under the marble floor was a basement, where the bases, chalk, and rakes were kept. But any peek I ever got scared me into believing it was a kind of jail, where Eddie the ump took unknowing little leaguers who ignored the warnings of their moms. 2, the circus. I stood in the cloud of fog, holding on to my dad's hand, my head on his hip. My brother stood on the other side, hands in his pockets. Great trucks painted with monsters, rendered flat and grotesque, produced their own cloud as they rumbled onto the playing fields, and the pictures came to life. Elephants, hairier than the pictures in the library books, more like woolly mammoths clomped down sagging gangplanks. Tattooed men, cigarettes jammed into the corners of their cruel mouths, cursed, pushed, pulled the beast to their task. The big top flapped and fluttered, and like a hot air balloon filled and took shape. We 3 watched without words, my brother, my dad, and me, as if it were a sacred ritual. Before my dad turned us around and we went home to our beds to sleep the last hours of the morning, so the raising of the tent mixed with the last dreams of sleep. 3, St. Rocco's Day. The women wore their hair in giant beehives, and the men slicked their hair back so tight to their heads that little curls escaped in pubic twist in their sideburns and out the tops of their t-shirts. The saint's night was hot and humid. every drop of moisture caught and combined with the grease of the sausages that sizzled in the great half drums, alive with charcoal and fire tended by the tattooed men, lit by the burst of flames as they mixed their sweat with the grease of their fare. 2 or 3 times an hour, the crowd would explode into a perfect circle, an instant ring where men, crazed with beer, beef, and heat, would beat each other's brains in. There were no sides or loyalties as the men were pushed into the ring, then trapped by the crowd, so they responded with a fury of punches, clinches, and kicks, finally to be decked from behind by the last man in, and then pulled out of the circle bloody and beaten, so another fluid was added to the night's potion. It took fireworks to calm the crowd, or at least to turn their heads heavenward, long enough to forget to fight. St. Rocco's and fireworks. The finale rocked the neighborhood, bursting each water molecule in the air and raining the crowd with grease. The code. My aunt walked straight for my brother, as if his passing through the door had created a vacuum in that lily-strangled room. She whispers the killer's name. The circles of mourners turned to see and escaped a sound like the breaking of buses. My brother, the spitting image of the body supine. She whispers the killer's name. They shift in their suits, they tug at their skirts, they try to turn away. She whispers the killer's name. A crowded bar on a Charlestown corner, gunshots and a boy supine. A crowd gone mute and blind. She whispers the killer's name. And the secret is safe with me. Thanks.
In poetry competitions, we tend to memorize our poems because it gives us a chance to look the audience in the eye, and it always seems to be worth an extra point or so. But it has a downside, too. This poem is called Nightmare on Mass Ave. The first 3 stanzas, they were loving it, and I had that killer last stanza to nail it down. All that remained was to deliver this 4th stanza, then snap it shut. Wham! I reach for the 4th stanza, and it's not there. What is the 4th stanza? Okay, pause, take a deep breath. It'll come to me. It always does. Remember, remember. I remember the year Clayton Delaney died. I break into a couple of verses of that. They won't know the difference, and they wouldn't have, but no, I didn't do that. Instead, I announce, now for a few stanzas that can only be heard by dogs, and begin moving my lips. The audience loves it, and they would have, but no, I didn't do that either. The best I could come up with on short notice was the knock-knock joke about World War III. Knock-knock!
Who's there?
I could have stalled a long time with that, but no, I didn't do that either. This is what stops people getting up in front of people. We know that sooner or later this is bound to happen, and now it's my turn. And really, it could be worse. How? How could it be worse? Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. At this moment, I am the quietest, most desperate man in Massachusetts. Neil Fetbroth is calling, Shelley, and he's right, but that's the last stanza. I think about the word silence. Silence is consent. Silence is golden. That must mean consent is golden. The cone of silence. The code of silence. What about the cone of the code of silence? I picture a huge, transparent plastic cone radiating downward and outward from the top of Bunker Hill Monument. Townies under it lip-syncing the street-smart transactions of every day. This is getting me nowhere. I look out over the audience, naked in my need, hoping to read the next line in someone's face. But every face is wearing the same line, and it's no help at all. It says, "Oh, you poor bastard. How long can this go on? Will I still be standing up here silent when everybody files out embarrassed and they start stacking chairs on tables?" Now, in the kindest act I've ever seen in a slam, Ron Goba gets up from his place by the door, walks to my table, sorts among my papers, and reads me the next line. But the line he reads me is the first line of the last stanza, not the fourth. Still, I finish it from there and sit down a beaten man. I check the page to see what the fourth stanza might be. And the fourth stanza is the last stanza. I always thought that when it happened, it would be by forgetting something that existed. Of course, I lost. I made the rounds and thanked the judges, telling anyone who'd listened that I didn't forget. I wiped out on a stanza that wasn't there. Keith Nystrom christens my episode Reverse Senility, belief that you've forgotten things that never really were. McCarthy's disease, several people suggest. Maybe there should be a stanza there. These are poets. For them, competition is an aberration. A good poem always has a chance to go on to another round of things. And no life event is truly over until the poem in it is discovered.
This is called Acadie. It's for the Acadians of Massachusetts, and especially for the Surettes of Massachusetts. My daughter, who is an anthropologist and archaeologist, was digging last year, and she'll be digging this year at Grand Pré, Nova Scotia, which is the site of the expulsion of the Acadians by the British in 1755. Acadie. My daughter digs to claim the past for her papa and me, to know why we bow our heads, to know why we look heavenward. She shows us where the past were buried, the broken pottery, the tarnished and twisted spoon, the rusted flintlock that whispers the past, that claimed we lived here and were busy with that living when they sent us away, bound to return to reclaim our language, our farms, our wives, husbands, and children, our God, Savior, and Mother, ourselves. 2. You're walking on Acadian graves, my daughter said. So we walked on, looking straight ahead. Look above, in the tree, an eagle's nest. So we looked heavenward. Here's where we dug. So we looked down. Up the steps and into the chapel, like the stations of the cross, we visit each painting, following the farmers to exile, the reds of coats and flames, the browns of soil and despair. We look for Mary, mistaken for Evangeline, but Mary for the bare right foot, Mary of the star on our flag. Below her, a list of names, and I find ours. We are included. We are named. We are Surette. We are Acadian. Nous sommes Surette. Nous sommes Acadiens. 3. We were not allowed to visit the expulsion cross. The guide said we would be risking our lives. 4. It's not a name that steps lightly off the tongue. It more often trips among the crack of Irish, the music of Italian. It's the other side of the family. Farmers and fishermen, Uncle Joe the oilman and Aunt Dot the seamstress. Dark and dull, homely and short, adults and children dressed in drab. But here, everyone is or has an uncle, aunt, grandmother who is. It marks each gravestone and mailbox. It's emblazoned on softball jerseys. It's Marie Babin's taken name, trying to outlive them all, like my Nana, 99 years old today. Still alive on the ghostly white tablet outside St. Joseph's Church. So I say it now a little more French. I say it without embarrassment. I say it like it has meaning as I cross the bridge over dangerous waters and drive the half moon of Surette's Island, Nova Scotia. Thanks.
This is called The Potato People. When I was a kid, my mother used to make great French fries. She'd wash the potatoes, lay them on a towel, and her hands would fly over them, never using a peeler, always the good sharp knife. Half the time she'd slice a finger in the process. She never made a big deal out of it, so we never thought twice about it. I remember the trails of peels linked like paper dolls that went into the garbage. My mother's French fries were loud in the pan. You'd have to raise your voice to be heard over them. They'd fry up crisp and dark brown, and we'd lavish them with salt that would melt into them, and inside they'd be soft and sweet. We were all delighted when frozen French fries came out. Mom converted overnight, maybe to save her fingers. We could have them much more often, and if we ever noticed they weren't quite as good, that something extraordinary had been lost, I suppose we chalked it up to life being full of trade-offs. 2. What's an Irish 7-course meal? A six-pack and a potato. They called us the potato people. Thackeray described us as ragged, ruined, and cheerful, like the land. We lived in our hillside clans, and we loved to laugh and fight and drink and recite and sing and dance and procreate, and all we ever ate was the potato. We'd harvest our potatoes in the fall and put enough away to feed our family for the year. And life was good for 44, 45 weeks. Somehow we always forgot that the old potatoes never made it through the summer without rotting. No freezers then. Men would take to the road looking for work, they'd say. And when they'd come home to harvest the new crop, some of the weaker children would have been winnowed out. Darwinian potatoes. We must have known the system wasn't designed with us in mind, but life is full of trade-offs. And hey, we didn't make the world. And maybe it always seemed that someday it just might work. And if it did, we'd have it all then, without change and without compromise. 3. My personal search for the perfect potato persists. Here and there I've thought for a while that I'd found it. My first taste of shoestring potatoes at the Universe Diner on Route 66 in Kingman, Arizona in 1959 when I was on the road. The best home fries in Boston today can be had at Sunday brunch at Country Life, the vegan place near Quincy Market. Just know you won't get real eggs or real coffee with them. Trade-offs. I've fallen for lyonnaise, au gratin, Delmonico potatoes, often delicious once, baked potatoes, foil wrapped in restaurants, sometimes so waxy succulent you have to eat the skin as well and end up getting foil between your teeth. But when you go back anticipating, they never quite live up to recollection. My wasp brother-in-law argues that the potato has no taste at all. It's just a vehicle for butter and salt, chives and sautéed onions, cheese and sour cream, for foil. But I suspect some temperament in the potato, some secret moon under which it insists that it be picked, some labor of love or song, some sacrifice, some bloodshed it demands. 4. I've been a potato person all my life. It started with college loans, then car loans. We always had a budget. We'd withdraw so much a week and not a penny more, and we never overdrew. But neither did we ever go the full 7 days between withdrawals. And always reason to believe tomorrow there'll be plenty, and debts incurred today will look like small potatoes. Meanwhile, we're the tuber from which they draw blood every month. And at those moments when we see with absolute crystal clarity that the system wasn't designed with us in mind, we hit the road. Because, hey, we didn't make the world. When what we really need is to raise our voice. What we really need is that good, sharp knife.
And that's the other side of my family, too. That's my mom's side. And this is for my wife, Catherine. The colors were familiar, red on white, the textures true, wool, flesh, and snow, and the tilt of her head, her smile, the shape of her face framed by the hood, familiar. Except as she walked the 50 feet after recognition towards me, I saw history travel backwards, time's arrow thrown back to the bow. We were old, decades in love collapsing to this moment, a lifetime of love, marked in an instant, a snowy day in Maine on the Colby campus for the rest of my life.
And this one is for my wife, Carol. It's called Time and Love, a sonnet for my Scully. At 18, I never thought I'd live to 25. That's how the young are. So easy to burn your bridges in front of you, and so dumb. But time is a wild card, a rogue dimension, obedient, if at all, to laws way beyond our ken. Why is it, for example, everything in life takes longer than we think it will, except one thing? You and I have been called the scary X-Files couple. Me reading your thoughts, you dreaming my dreams. Time doles us brief, occasional conjugal visits. But I've traveled the stars, a message in my heart that's had your name on it since the Big Bang. Take this heart now. The truth is in here.
This is a long piece from my book, Malden. It's a childhood piece. It's called School Was Full of Wounding and the Wounded. 1. Father Guiney. My first day assembled in the basement, exposed pipes above our heads, cramped knee to knee, our noses filled with the stink of decades of sour milk. Father Guiney. My parents called him wonderful. All the boys loved him. Father Guiney. My brother was silent on the subject. We have to take our cowboy gloves off. We're heading for town, he says. Father Guiney, without warning, exploded into a rage, snatched up a student by his hair and cuffed him twice in the head, slammed him back in his seat with such adult ferocity that his glasses flew across the room. Now do you think you can behave? I knew I could behave, but I would never love this Father Guiney. I just wished I could keep those gloves on all the way to school and home again. 2. Joe thumped in every day, his stiffened leg wrapped in a 10-pound brace, squeaking like a rusty gate. He was always the first one tagged. John climbed the windowsill one day. Please, sister, I just got to draw the Bunker Hill Monument. I just gotta. And they took him away, and we never saw him again. Some kids said he went to a mental hospital. Others said worse, public school. Donnie got a puppy, and on their first walk home, they were struck by a truck that had jumped the curb. The dog was killed, and now Donnie had the same limp as Joe, squeaking like a rusty gate. Now he was the first one tagged. Bobby's mother died. He was the tallest kid in class by half a foot, but he took to walking stooped over like a giraffe, as if the weight of his sorrow sat right between his shoulder blades. 3. We gathered in the auditorium of the old Red School only a few years before it was condemned to watch the fire safety film. The children in the film made maps of their houses and practiced escape routes. So later in the film, when their house was ablaze, we witnessed a perfect evacuation. I always meant to nag my parents to make similar plans, but somehow I believe the fire was caused by those plans. So I lived with this burden alone. 4. A mouse, dashing in front of sister, letting out a yelp. Eddie, on his feet like a cat, grabbing the wastebasket, slamming it over the mouse, trapping it. Amazing. Eddie did nothing in class. A bully with a dirty neck and a chipped front tooth, but today a hero. Sister blushing at his heroics. Mr. Kelly, walking with a limp, dustpan in hand, throwing his body sideways like a buoy in rough surf. Overalls and a blue denim navy shirt and a red paisley handkerchief hanging from his back pocket. He was a collection of circles, head, belly, and bottom, breathing in deep rasp. Where is it? He's under the barrel. Mr. Kelly lifted the barrel, raising the dustpan, decapitated the mouse, collected the 2 pieces of mouse into the dustpan, pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his brow and then the spot of mouse blood on the floor. Sister, face as white as the band across her forehead, looking like any of the girls in my class, innocent as all of them. I thought you might have let it go in the schoolyard, or it just would have come back again. Oh, said Sister, her humiliation, her helplessness, running across her face like that mouse had run across the classroom floor. Mr. Kelly, grunting out of the room. Take out your religion books, let's get back to work, she said quietly, and looked out the window for escape. But all she saw were the traffic lights turn yellow to red.
This is called A Prayer for John Fernandez. In the late 70s, Catholics were actually studying the Bible, a really radical idea. It had always seemed as though the church didn't trust us around the Bible, like those warnings on the back of a TV set. We strongly suggest you not open this up if you don't know squat about what you're doing. I was part of a Bible discussion group led by a young, tall, thin as a rail curate with the brooding good looks of the young Montgomery Clift. The women of the parish had dubbed him Father What a Waste. We had people in that group who were always trying to trap him into heresy. Father was a Vatican II person, all about forgiveness, reconciliation, a disciple of John the 23rd's aborted attempt to open the windows of the church. He had an air of sad sanctity, as though he was wearing a hair shirt under his cassock and collar. I remember somebody saying of him, for one who has no darkness in himself, he has the best understanding I've ever come across of darkness in other people. I also knew Father from CCD, the longest hour of my week, trying to pass on what few nuggets of truth I had picked up along the way to a handful of hormonal public school boys who saw my classroom as a holding cell. The only way I could maintain any illusion that learning was taking place was by sending my discipline problems to Father What a Waste. One night when they were giving me a really bad time, I gave them an ultimatum. The next kid who opened his mouth would be sent to Father's office. And of course, the next kid that did was the best kid in the class, John Fernandez. All the hard kids had the street smarts to know I wasn't kidding. John didn't want to leave my room. I had to haul him out physically. Father happened to be patrolling the hall at that moment, took custody of John from me a second before I might have actually struck him. Another time, Father was visibly upset when he arrived at our Bible discussion group. One of the women prodded him gently, and finally he admitted that he had just caught a boy he trusted with his keys, borrowing quarters from the Coke machine. He felt deeply betrayed. Someone asked, with only the slightest hint of taunting, if Father had forgiven the boy. After a long pause, he said, "Give me 3 days." In one of these Bible sessions, we talked about the forgiveness of sin. How could murderers be forgiven? Rapists? Father saw their crimes as products of a long string of decisions, where maybe the only decision on the string that involved free will was the first one. And maybe in God's eyes, that first decision had no moral content, yet determined everything that followed. Somebody demanded to know what Father What a Waste's definition of sin was, and I wrote down his exact words because I had this vague but urgent sense that something important had been left out. I went home and studied it and came back the next week primed to nail Father. I asked, if that's your definition of sin, then what's the difference between a sin and a life mistake, like taking the wrong job or marrying the wrong person? As I look back, it's apparent that both of those examples were issues I was just beginning to deal with in my own life. And I know this story would be so much better if I could only reconstruct his definition, but you're going to have to trust that my logic was ironclad. I knew I had him. His definition didn't allow for any difference between a sin and a simple wrong turning. But apparently I didn't have him, because he had obviously thought this through before, and he answered simply, "There is no difference." That shut me up real quick, plus gave me something to wonder about down all the years since. Father Waterways got his picture in the paper recently over a report that the institute that deals with pedophile priests had discharged him as an untreatable sociopath. And that set me thinking about him and the difference between a sin and a bad life decision. I know he must have done the kind of things he was accused of. There's no room for any mistaken identity, no legal technicalities to compromise my judgment. I know my church was guilty of a hideous and hypocritical mistake in handling this and other cases like it. A mistake and an institutional sin and a crime against nature. I'm thinking it'll take about 100 years of penance and mortification and amending its ways, confessing that it doesn't know squat about human sexuality before this church can presume to any moral authority whatever. But I also know that Jesus is still Jesus, and this is still my church, that wrong in one thing doesn't make it wrong in everything, though this one's going to take a lot more than 3 days to forgive. And I still believe that Father Waterwaist was a good and maybe even holy person when I knew him, though the reason he was so understanding of the darkness of others was that he did indeed have a darkness of his own, growing very slowly, like a prostate cancer. He had been told that he could heal with magical thinking and organic foods, a cancer that eventually consumed his entire beautiful spiritual being. And I wonder what that first and almost innocent decision was that sent him down his terrible road to untreatability. I pray for him every day. I pray for all the priests, especially all the many who never laid a hand on anyone, so humiliated, so unjustly, the worst kind of guilt by association, yet the most irresistible. I pray for the victims. It must have been as if God himself was abusing you. I hope you get enough out of the church that you never have to worry about money again. I hope you may be finally able to forgive, because only then will you know yourself healed. And I say a special prayer for John Fernandez, whom I had to drag out of his seat, and for all the discipline problems I handed over to Father Waterwaist from my CCD class. Most prayers are aimed at things we cannot know about the future. This one is for things that I don't want to know about the past.
The Savior. Streets reserved 7 days a week for endless games of street hockey. Tennis courts and schoolyards filled with stick-wielding boys, all pretending to be Bobby. Ice rinks popping up in town after town to accommodate all these Bobbies. Working-class kids, working-class Bobbies. Irish and Italian kids, Irish and Italian Bobbies, all, except for me. I pretended to be Phil. And if we Catholics know who the saviors are, we also know a good confession. This is a confession for Jack McCarthy. My great aunt Mabel, who rescued my mother from her mother, claims that when she held me as an infant, I looked into her soul. Now I know gas can cause a baby to smile, but what kind of intestinal disturbance can cause a baby to look into his great aunt's soul? As a boy, I chased my own soul, waiting for God to tap my shoulder, give me the call. I was the perfect candidate, passive, harmless, but I never felt the tap. My mother blames it on girls. And the day that Joanne Breen grew breast under her uniform's bib knocked against my heart, surely as God could tap a shoulder. She had red hair, for God's sakes. But it was Father Supple croaking the high mass that scared me off. In the boys' choir, I was relegated to the Brum Brums as some Endicott boy sang the lead to Little Drummer Boy. No one would call my singing praying twice, and I figured no God wanted me to croak his praises. Now, last week, my high school English teacher told my dad that 30 years ago, she looked right into my soul and knew I was special. My dad replied, all I ever saw was a hockey stick. And she said, that's what all dads say, and I said, nothing. What does a guy say to this, for God's sakes? Now, I don't look into people's souls anymore. I gave that up in infancy. And the priesthood, I still can't sing my way to my soul. And no one claims lately to see into my soul. I think I see shadows in my peripheral vision, like I used to see Matty Martin coming in late in the slot. I didn't look then, and I don't look now. It's enough to feather the pass and go to the net for the rebound. It's enough. It has to be enough, because I'm so damn happy, so goddamn happy.
Could we have one more round of applause for today's speaker? Thanks for that.